Architecture is really the art and science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello, this is Vikram Prakash, and you are listening to Architecture Talk. Each episode, we try and have a conversation with a contemporary thinker on issues of architecture and architectural thinking, and our goal is somehow to get into the minds of people who think about architecture in complex ways, who try and tie the threads together, and who advance the frontier of what architecture has been, what it is today, and therefore, by implication, what it might be tomorrow. Today I'm talking to my good friend Ken Tadashi Oshima, who's Professor of Architecture here at the University of Washington, who's also the Chair of Japan Studies, and who recently has just finished a term as President of the Society of Architectural Historians. An expert on Japanese modernism, broadly defined, Ken has been thinking about the complexities of the global relationship that architects of Japan and the architectural history of modern Japan has had in terms of the Edo period, which is to say before the war, after the war, and in the recent past. Through it all, his own life has been inscribed by the fantastic transnational commerce of architectural and architectural ideas, particularly those between Japan and the United States. I ask him about that life, and I ask him about the story of architecture that has occurred across the Pacific Ocean. Here we go. Well, welcome to Architecture Talk, Ken.
Thank you.
Ken, when I look at your CV, and you're so productive, and you produce articles by the day, and you teach a full course load, and you run the Japan Studies program here at the University of Washington. How do you do all this?
Well, it's easier to look back and see things accomplished, but looking forward, there's always this fear of failure or not meeting a deadline. But if anything, seeing a life of projects, the broader questions that inspire it, but how that can really continue on from a particular paper that might be published, or that also can be the basis of another seminar, and that will engage something else in some other ways. A paper I wrote at Berkeley as a Masters of Architecture student on garden cities in Japan for Spiro Kostov in his last lecture course eventually was published in the Journal of Society of Architectural Historians. I was encouraged to submit it. It went through revisions, and that was the basis for doing more work later on when I entered the PhD program at Columbia and seeing it from a new perspective then. So really seeing all these projects have a continual life. You think it's over, but it isn't. For example, I engage a lot of exhibitions, whether it be curation of that, writing for that, and it's very temporary, but it's very exciting to see it engaged by people who visit, having talks or symposia for that.
Right.
It's published in a catalog, and then it has a further life in printed form that is really exciting in the way that when you're only publishing, you don't necessarily have that audience.
Right. I think that's really a good thing. I mean, of course, we are wedded to the publication world and the scholarly text, but to always think about multimedia, particularly in this day and age, don't you think that architectural historians, besides writing scholarly books and articles, should be mining every new media opportunities?
Absolutely. And so this past fall...
Like podcasting.
Exactly. This past fall at the Chicago Architectural Biennial had the theme Making New History, with Sharon Johnson and Mark Lee as curators. It was very interesting for me to have a conversation with them as president of the Society of Architectural Historians about what this Making New History could be. And in the context of Chicago, Frank Lloyd Wright becomes very important, but especially in terms of exhibitions. So how he was able to promote himself before becoming the global architect, how he was able to present ideas through drawings, models, that the biennial continues to this day, but to see a longer trajectory of what that could be in terms of realizing those ideals, whether it be in Tokyo for the Imperial Hotel or later on in different contexts. So the way he could embrace all of these different possibilities.
Right. So in fact, what you're telling me is, we've got all these multimedia today, but really Frank Lloyd Wright, and we certainly know Corbusier, everybody has been using all the media for a long time. In the old days, even Vitruvius was writing books, and the preferred medium of Alberti was to write text and treatises and pamphlets and get the word out.
The Voss-Smith portfolio that brings his work to an international audience.
Right.
Beyond
That was
Chicago.
very influential, wasn't it?
But using techniques of woodblock prints that he had admired in his own collecting to depict his own work, that was embracing all of this, as you say, the different publication possibilities, the different ways of seeing, and the different audiences.
And that's how people like Frank Lloyd Wright and Corbusier and such actually had a significant reputation well beyond their local area of expertise, particularly internationally.
Absolutely.
In terms of how their texts and portfolios made their way across borders well before their architecture did, and in a sense well beyond their architecture. I mean, is that one of the keys to transnationalism? I mean, I know this is kind of a big topic that we are all looking at. What smooths the operations of transnationality?
Well, I think it's very interesting to look at it historically from the 19th century through the 20th century into today, and how there are ways these ideas and people move. Publications are easier to transport than buildings, obviously.
Right.
And how initially Frank Lloyd Wright is being inspired by Japan through prints and collecting those.
He collected a lot of Japanese prints, didn't he?
Absolutely. And so was also a tremendous dealer, making a lot of money.
Is that right?
Absolutely. And there's a whole scandal related to that. But how he's able to draw from that initially within the context of Wisconsin at Taliesin or in Chicago, then to travel to Japan in 1905, have a different perspective based on that climate, seeing different customs, etc., and how this, in counterpoint to traveling to Italy, is all part of what he's drawing from. So what I would argue, and what we in the Museum of Modern Art exhibition of Frank Lloyd Wright talked about as the first global architect in that way, because he's really drawing from so many different contexts and actually practicing. So whether it be in Tokyo.
No, wait a minute. Now let's try and drill down a little bit. Is a transnational way of practicing and being in the world the same as being a global architect? Are they the same, similar, or different? What is your thinking on this?
For me, there's a question of scale. And global is perhaps a much more contemporary word.
Right.
That we think of in terms of capital, in terms of a internet age where things can travel instantly around the world. But of any of the architects, perhaps Frank Lloyd Wright and Le Corbusier are broadest in their purview of sources, of travels, and actually of practice, being in these places to build. And transnational, in my mind, does really emphasize that trans aspect of how you connect nations or places, and slightly different from international. International is perhaps much more an earlier 20th century term. We think of international architecture from the Bauhaus or the publications of that following World War I.
There's the idea of universality in international, right?
Absolutely.
And with this transnational is more about sort of import, export, taking a suitcase with you and then buying things from the other place, whether it's ideas or impressions or actual things, and then bringing them back and back and forth thing, yes?
And then I think of transformation, so how it changes.
Right.
Along is the in way. Between, but the emphasis on this transformation in transnational, so that it isn't simply the two countries represented in between, but there is a creative process that draws from these multiple sources to...
Why do you say countries? Is it about nation states or is it about
place? I say that in terms of transnational.
Right.
The national. But I think we could say this whole aspect of trans is a perspective unto itself, or I would often describe it as in-between space, where it does become this very potent realm that can bring multiple sources together that are not necessarily just of nations in a nation state, or not necessarily of specific ethnic backgrounds or regions, but the notion of trans, I think, is a very active one, and
it's a verb.
It's
a verb rather than a noun.
Exactly.
It's a thing you do rather than a descriptor, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Well, let's talk about your transnationality, just your own self, Ken. Now, you were born here, right?
I was born in Colorado.
Yes.
Both my parents are from Tokyo.
Okay, so your parents were from Tokyo. They came over to the United
States in the 1950s, but separately. They met actually in Minnesota.
Minnesota.
Of all places. But
so you're a Midwestern boy, really?
Well, I would say Colorado is not the Midwest, it's the Rocky Mountains.
Fine,
and, that with my parents, my father was a botanist plant pathologist, went to Colorado and Minnesota for graduate work, whereas my mother worked at the American consulate in Tokyo, had friends there, went to South Carolina, then to Kentucky, and then to Minnesota, where she met my father. So it's a very complex journey in terms of how that works. But myself, focusing on architecture in Japan, connected to a broader context.
Did you go to Japan often as a kid? Did your parents take you?
As a kid, but I really did go to school in the United States, K through 12.
But like Indians, we take our kids home every summer.
So I was exposed to that, but I really did have a dual background in terms of speaking English in school, hearing, experiencing Japanese, but not as an adult until studying it formally in college, and then spending more years after college in Japan.
So when did you spend an extended period of time in Japan? So
the first extended period was right after college for 2 years.
You were learning the language? Or?
I was there as a research student on the Monbusho Ministry of Education Fellowship as an American.
Now, why did you go there? Was this your initiative, or you were looking for roots, or your parents wanted to go?
So my undergraduate degree focused on Japanese architecture, and I wrote a thesis on post-war Japanese houses. And so
you
it
were
was
always working on Japanese
a
architecture.
natural trajectory from that. At college, right, one of my first classes in college was on Japanese architecture, so that set in motion what I'm doing from many different perspectives, but seeing that outside of Japan. And my first professor, William Coldrake, is Australian, spent time in Japan, and also this within art history, so there are many different filters and lenses in looking at this, but I have always been interested in that. But it's interesting you bring it back to this time, because in applying to college, one of my essays was on Frank Lloyd Wright and how he would bring together East and Western sources in his own work that I found inspiring.
As a graphing of your own autobiography as well.
Perhaps. And that being epitomized in the Frank Lloyd Wright room at the Metropolitan Museum, and being very interesting to understand that on many different levels through time.
Well, why do you think American architects, and America in general, or modern architects, were so into Japan?
It is on many different levels, I think. Early on at international exhibitions, it's in relationship to art, so the ukiyo-e woodblock prints.
No, I know there's all this good stuff, but they could have been into Chinese stuff or Indian stuff, but no, they're into Japan. Why Japan?
Whether it be in terms of a culture of building and realization of work from the late 19th century to the present day, a constant embrace of whether it be classical styles or of new technologies on concrete, or ways that push the boundaries of architecture that you see, whether it be in Toyo Ito's Sendai MediaTek, or other ways that are just often on paper outside. This is, I think, something that Manfredo Tofure was very interested in writing a book on contemporary Japanese architecture in the 1960s, of how Archigram is just drawing their visions while Kenzo Tange and others were building it, realizing that utopian ideal. So I think that's one very powerful aspect of it.
Mm-hmm. There's a kind of Japanese architecture and art is very recognizable through the modernist visual aesthetic lens. It's coherent in a way that a Hindu temple outline isn't. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think it becomes interesting to look at this through time. As the historian, seeing it, Japanese architecture presented in the 1950s and 60s, for example, the Katsura Villa through Kenzo Tange's work, with layout by Herbert Bayer, and having a very Bauhaus perspective, crops off the roof of the Katsura Villa, so it is perfectly rectilinear, and whether it be in terms of the sliding panels or the stepping stones. And one that I had a conversation or dinner one time with Robert Venturi, and he was saying how he was not interested in Japan, of his impression that it's very minimal and the kind of Miesian or Bauhausian perspective that you talk about. But when he went to Japan and realized how complex and contradictory it can be, how excited he was. And so depending on what you're interested in, you can find that resonance.
Sure.
Christopher Dresser, the great British industrial designer going over in 1876 and seeing the ornamental character of the Japanese context and being the epitome of Victorian design, and how Nikko Toshogu Shrine, in his eyes, was the Alhambra of Japan.
Right. And
So-
when I went, all I saw was the sort of Buddhist meditational qualities of everything, because that's what I was into at that time.
So it isn't singular,
Yeah.
but there are these ways that it connects that perhaps continually can be inspiring for...
No, I totally accept that. That of course the modernists are seeing what they want to see, and there are many different ways to look at it, and there is diversity and richness, and I'm totally in sync with that. Nonetheless, I really feel there is something about Japanese visual culture, in particular art and architecture, that marries well with the Western post-Enlightenment thinking in some ways, in spite of the fact that, we've had a major World War scrap between Japan and the West.
Well, obviously it depends on how you define modern and modernism,
Right.
and whether the Katsura Villa built in the 1600s was modern to begin with,
Yeah.
and in terms of its flexibility, rationality of construction, in terms of modules, etc. If during the Edo period, the construction of Edo as a capital really created a modern state,
Right.
before the nation state.
Sure.
Japanese historians will argue in many different ways, whether it be in terms of how it's constructed as a governmental entity or the role of classes, etc. But it's one that, when you look at what is considered classic Japanese culture through tea ceremony, ikebana flower arranging, through the showing idiom of building, that is coming from this period of Zen Buddhism entering Japan,
Right.
the way that things are developing on this level of an aesthetic minimalism, and elements that are very strong later on to connect in the 1950s.
Right.
But it's with many other historical factors.
Sure.
So,
Sure.
but that resonance obviously is strong, and the question of, is it also drawing from all these sources within Asia? So Buddhism from India, China, Korea to
Right.
Japan, and how
Right.
that develops, and then that intersecting with modern nations as Japan opens up officially 1868 to
Right.
look to England, Prussia, France, Italy, and bring them together in a new transnational way,
Right.
but defined by this island nation that can be more identifiable than in a broader...
So would you
geographic
identify the Meiji Restoration of 1868 as a paradigmatic Asian transnational moment?
It's $1 million question, or...
I want you to speculate wildly.
But because, it's very interesting to travel through Japan and see the diversity of the islands, and how leaders of the uprising, Sakamoto Ryoma and others, are in these periphery areas, and how, whether it was really this decline of the Tokugawa, or whether it was a revolution or a restoration.
Right.
There are all different ways one can conceive of this, but the way it seized the moment to
really become transnational. I mean, there are so many revolutions, but this is a sort of a very specific kind of a revolution.
to selectively be transnational. And so it's
What do you mean
not
selectively be transnational?
so the Meiji government, the Iwakura mission, is going to many different countries and seeing
Yeah.
what connects with Japan. What can we adopt? Not everything.
Right.
Driving on the left side of the road,
Right,
or the
right.
parliamentary system,
Yeah.
and other things in the United States that really don't apply because it's just too big of a country. And how that you can see from earlier on that there are sources, when you look at the tea ceremony, of bringing in tea from Sung China, and how even the role of missionaries from Portugal
Right.
are shaping perceptions of these tight spaces that you could argue do become the tea houses,
Right,
such
sure.
that it's akin to the small spaces that they had on ships
Right.
as they were traveling from Holland to Japan.
It could be. And now that we are, happily trading in cultural stereotypes at large level, I mean, one of the sort of perceptions of Japan is that it's an extremely nationalistic culture. I mean, very proud of its identity and history. And at the same time, extremely transnational. Everything is in Japan, fantastic English writers and global filmmakers, and, there's international restoration revolution in the 19th century, and embrace of modernism, latest fashion. Is that contradiction at all? I mean, I don't see the American nationalists being very transnational nowadays.
Well, there is this whole construction of the nation and what that is, and the notion of we Japanese that can be very rhetorical on the right. There are many different perspectives on this, but when you really live in Japan and really understand so many different currents, you can see how there are truths to anything, but in terms of fashion, there is a tradition of kimono that still exists, and how that can connect to, for example, the work of Issei Miyake, and how he can embrace also the Sarabai family in textiles, going to India, and reconceiving fabrics in all different ways between these different contexts. And so he's building on these traditions, but inquisitive about outside nations. I think one aspect of this perhaps can be Japan being composed of 4 main islands and having the necessity to really look out. It's not necessarily a small country, but always looking to whether it be China or to Europe or to America or to other parts of Asia, and seeing that it's not sustainable to maintain the nation strictly as an isolated entity, at least the limitations of that were seen in the Tokugawa period, but the need to look to this, master it, but then bring it back in different ways. So the Italian-Japanese cuisine, or with fashions, going to Paris and mastering certain things with certain at certain ateliers and so forth, but how that could be informed in different ways back in Japan or back and forth. And there is a history of this, but what I find most interesting is this back and forth, because when you are only in Japan, it can actually be very limiting. You have the master and the disciple, and that continues on. But for example, with sushi, you wouldn't have the rolls only in Japan.
Yeah.
The California roll was discovered, invented outside of Japan. And
so you don't think they're going to invent the California roll in Japan or
well,
sushi
and then
in Japan?
then it's re-imported, and how that boomerang effect works. Myself, I'm from Japan ethnically, but born in the United States, and so how that gives me different perspectives than if I had only lived in Japan, only went to school in Japan. And so that definitely gives me a different position than people I have as colleagues who are based in Tokyo, who have always lived in Tokyo.
Right. Well, that'll be a good time to take a break. We're talking to Ken Oshima, who's Professor of Architecture here at the University of Washington. Hello everyone, thanks for listening to Architecture Talk. We release a new conversation every other Wednesday. So, if you're enjoying this conversation, please do be sure to visit our website and to check out some of the earlier conversations. From the website, you can also subscribe to this podcast and you can listen to the other episodes. You can also simply directly subscribe to us via Spotify or via the podcast app. And of course, we are available to be heard via any of the other podcasting apps that are available on the internet, such as Stitcher, Overcast, etc. We would also love to hear from you if you have any questions or just some comments, or even have a suggestion for a future episode. You can reach us via the contacts page on architecturetalk.org. Thank you for listening again. Hello, this is Vikram Prakash, and we're in the middle of a conversation with Ken Oshima, who's Professor of Architecture at the University of Washington. And we are trying to get into the dynamics of transnationality, transnational practice, transnational ways of thinking, particularly with respect to Japan. And I wonder, would you describe Antonin Raymond as a Japanese architect?
It's a very interesting question, because within Japan, some people see him as the father or grandfather of modern Japanese architecture.
Okay.
Because he established his practice in the 1920s in Tokyo and really pioneered reinforced concrete, exposed as a surface as well as structure, epitomizing his own house. But he also employed Kunio Maekawa, and through that there is a connection to Kenzo Tange and Junzo Yoshimura, etc., that really outlines a field that has established modern practice, but can be seen to lead directly to Antonin Raymond.
So he's considered to be a Japanese sensei.
On one hand. By others, he's not always included in the history of modern Japanese architecture because he's not Japanese. He is the Czech-born American architect who practiced in Japan for some 20 years before, 20 years after World War II, but could also be seen as the foreigner. And how...
Is that a big thing in Japan, seeing the insiders and the foreigners?
So there's a history of the foreign experts going to Japan to teach, whether that be Josiah Condor or others. And so they are the experts, but there's always a little bit of a distance. With Antonin Raymond's case, I think it really evolves through his extensive time living and practicing in Japan and the sheer extent of his built work. Some 400 projects attest to how much he really did, not only in Japan, but back in the United States and then in India. But his transnational perspective is evolving. He leaves the Czechoslovakia when it's Czechoslovakia, but obviously things change with World War II.
Right.
And family members die. We discovered that he's Jewish in origin, and
I did not
he
know
had
that.
a different spelling of his name,
Right.
Raymond, but he's designing Catholic churches and Christian colleges in Japan and seen as the expert in that. And so whether he's European or also his first firm is promoting him as the American architect, and one, at least in terms of technology and scale of practice, is pioneering at that time, having worked not only with Frank Lloyd Wright, but Cass Gilbert.
Right.
So he is fulfilling that hat, but he's definitely doing many different things. So there are many hats.
And that's the sort of transnational game. It's like learning to wear very different hats.
Absolutely.
And sort of every time you wear it in a kind of different way. And it's also a matter of wearing the wrong hat at the wrong place, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, I don't know if you feel that. I always feel like I'm wearing the wrong hat. Isn't it? You always feel like, well, am I the Indian, or am I the Seattle guy, or am I the American, or am I the transnational guy, or am I the...
well, I think it's never clear cut. The glass half full, half empty, and how people perceive that. So Raymond in...
Or how you feel as a person.
That's true. That's true.
That's what I'm interested in. Is like, what did Raymond feel practicing in Japan for 40 years?
Which, when you're in that context, you're responding to builders, you're responding to practices of how that is all operating. There's a culture that is different from Park Avenue in New York.
Right.
And being able to respond to that is certainly a skill that he had himself, drawing from Frank Lloyd Wright, Le Corbusier, Auguste Perret, but also his staff in Japan, that makes him in between. And so Antonin Raymond is drawing from many different sources, and he's architecturally looking to Le Corbusier, he's worked with Frank Lloyd Wright, looking to Auguste Perret, having worked for Cass Gilbert, but also the many sources on his staff and builders. So he's really drawing from all these different people, inspirations, contexts, but because of that, by some, he could be seen as compromising all of this, that he's eclectic or without a backbone, not strictly the disciple of one individual.
Right.
But his skill of being in between, I would argue, is really what allowed for the breakthroughs in his buildings, doing things unconventionally.
Right.
For example, the Reader's Digest building that he constructs after World War II is remarkable, not only because it's right in front of the Imperial Palace, but it's also one that uses this technology of working with Paul Weidlinger, the New York structural engineer, having this kind of tree-like column structure that the Japanese Architectural Professional Structural Engineering Association is saying will fall down, is unacceptable by their standards. By American standards, it's seemed to be possible. How he's able to navigate between this to actually realize that and use the skill of the builders, use all of what is available there in Japan at that time, as well as what he can draw from outside. So that larger purview does become very important in this.
So, who is the example of the reverse? I mean, we have Frank Lloyd Wright practicing in Japan. We have Raymond there. Corbusier builds a building. Now, are there Japanese origin architects also practicing around the world? Now, of course, there's Toyo Ito, there is everybody. Let's talk about that.
Well,
why is it that there are all these Japanese architects practicing around? There are no Indian architects practicing around the world. The Japanese architects are just like they're like the Swiss and the Denmark and Dutch architects practicing around the world. Why is that?
Whether there's a culture of building that allows these designers to really have experiences early on that allows them to really develop full, robust careers, that's a big part of it. Kenzo Tange, others are quite young when they break into the global.
But though she's hanging out with Kenzo Tange at the same time in early 60s, but I don't see Doshi practicing around the world. What is it that enables the Japanese set of, fantastic architects to crack into the international stage?
There are...
Which is to say, really the Western stage.
No.
I don't see them practicing in China or India.
Well, and, this is relatively recent when we look at the post-war period, and Kenzo Tange is probably one of the first in this regard. And Fumihiko Maki, under him, studies at Harvard, works with Jose Luis Sert, is also very well equipped to build very early on in his career. That his wife is from the Takenaka construction family, and so from 1960 he's building extensively in Japan, as well as at Washington University where he's teaching. He's given all these opportunities very early on, and I think that's true of architects to this day. They're given opportunities to design houses because there's so much building, constant rebuilding. That's true for Antonin Raymond. He arrives in 1920, or just the eve of that, and with the 1923 Tokyo earthquake, is given a decade worth of work because of the sheer amount of construction that is required. And he would not have had that opportunity to the same degree had he stayed in New York. And it's one that I think is cultivating these designers from an early age.
Is the status architects have either this mythical, Gregory Peck, Howard Rourke image in the US, or they are considered to be just nothing? What is the status of an architect in modern Japanese? Is this part of the culture? They're given so many projects early?
Well, it really depends on who you're talking to, and even Toyo Ito will say that they're not given full respect by everyone, but it's a building culture that is not litigical. You are not suing everyone all the time. You're working together for the most part. Not, there are problems and so forth, like everywhere, but it's not the same degree that you would have here in the United States. And so there's far more experimentation based on that. And one that, the Imperial Hotel for Frank Lloyd Wright is his largest building to date. He doesn't have anything of that scale before, and to have not only really a hotel, but an urban microcosm that has a theater, the dining spaces, the entertaining areas, the shopping arcade, so forth and so on, that he did not have before. Other architects, Stephen Hole designing the Nexus housing in Kyushu, Ren Koolhaus also early on, some of these key projects, FOA for the Yokohama Ferry Terminal, they did not have that experience before doing that of that scale, and once they had that project built, they could go on to do many other things. But so the power of realization is one. But I just want to go back to this whole issue of transnational practice. You have other architects such as Shigeru Ban, who is educated in the States, first at SCI-Arc and Cooper Union, providing a different perspective on practice. He does work for Arata Isozaki, but often seen as being outside of the kind of mainstream of pedagogy from Tokyo University that you might see with Ken Okuma or others, but that through an unconventional approach has embraced cardboard tubes and disaster relief housing and other ways that through his work, his influence from whether it be John Haydock or time in Los Angeles, has been able to bring that back to his practice in Tokyo to see new opportunities or see opportunities in Paris, whether it be the Pompidou Metz or having his office attached to the Pompidou Center. And so I think there are these contemporary trajectories to this.
I just want to go back to that autobiography question. Did you ever feel that you had to study Japanese architecture because you were ethnically Japanese in background? Or let me put it differently. Did you ever wish that you had nothing to do with Japan and you were working on, I don't know, South American architecture of Monte Alban? Have you ever struggled with this question, or has it always been natural for you?
No, it's interesting. I mean, early on, growing up in Colorado, speaking English, I really embraced that period of being American and not necessarily wanting to study Japanese at that time, not necessarily.
I mean, a lot of my nieces and nephews, they want to have nothing to do with India
But it's, I think, being exposed at different times in college, embracing it much more seriously.
Why did you start embracing it more seriously?
Maybe a particular interest that was familiar in a certain way, but also seeing it from this outside perspective could be a way to discover different aspects. But I say that many different sides to Japan that I find interesting, but not in its entirety. And so how you connect that with the United States, with other places. I first started teaching seminars at Columbia and really wanted to teach to connect the Western and non-Western contexts. And but really being told that to satisfy certain curricula requirements, it had to be non-Western.
It had to be.
It had to be. And that it couldn't be, just modern, to embrace not only European modernism and Japanese modernism. It had to have that divide.
Right.
Based on that curricular requirement.
Yes,
and I mean, there are ways that I try to really play with that, but it is often seen that you have to only be one or the other, and
or that when I finished my PhD, I was a scholar of post-structuralism and Derrida and Le Corbusier and modernism and stuff like that. I got my first teaching job and they said, "Oh, you have to teach a course on architecture of India." I was like, "What? That's nothing to do with my PhD." But there was this certain expectation, which then I fulfilled, and then I learned a lot, and now I'm into it. But I don't know if you ever experienced something like that.
Well, and that expectation of being a specialist on Japan, outside of Japan versus in Japan is very different.
I'm saying here in America.
But it's interesting of what you would be doing within Japan, and you probably would do a lot less connected to Japan there than outside, just in terms of what's required. And within Japan, there's so many specialists, so that you are looking at the 16th century in this region through this particular typology. You wouldn't see the big picture.
Right.
And it's one that also, from perspective of Seattle, you see it's close, but also all different ways it's changed over time. One point I want to make is that when we say Japan, there are so many different ways things have changed from 19th century, 1920s, 1930s, 1950s, 1960s. It has evolved in so many different ways, from being this superpower to being a kind of secondary country, or how the economy has risen and dropped, and population has risen and dropped. And so there's so many ways you could approach this that become interesting.
Sure.
So again, the lack of singularity in this.
Right. I mean, and inversely, at least this is my experience in India, and it sounds like it might be similar in Japan, that when in India they teach architectural history, it's very India focused. There's a sort of a certain fiction of an Indian architectural history. And then there's the West is like this modern architecture, and then maybe a little, the worst stereotype of Western history, and the worst sort of nationalistic version of Indian architectural history. And it's almost more difficult to push the global architectural history perspective, the transnational architectural history perspective in India than it is over here, whereas you would think it would be easier there. I don't know, is your experience been similar in Japan?
Yeah, there are definitely parallels in looking at the Japanese context. And my PhD dissertation, that became my first book, International Architecture and Interwar Japan, really tried to address this of the Japanese context seen through two individuals of Horiguchi and Yamada, and also Antonin Raymond in this picture. So they're all practicing international architecture in their own ways, but depending on how you see that and how you define that, can be far more interesting implications of ways that can play out than this singular one. And really there are very few works that go across time in this way, that bridge Japan with other countries in that same context. And yet the architects themselves are generally far more transnational. So the history is not necessarily caught up with the actual practice.
Well, it's been great talking to you, Ken. Thanks for being on Architecture Talk.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening to Architecture Talk. This is Vikram Prakash. I am the host of the show, and our show's producer is Elizabeth Umbenhauer. If you like the show, please do remember to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. And also take a moment and rate us on iTunes. Thank you very much, and see you next time.